Good afternoon, Prime Minister. My name is Stephanie Bose. I'm Counsel for the Province of Alberta. You were asked this morning if any of the First Ministers could have said or done anything to change your mind about the Emergencies Act. And I understood your evidence to be yes, if one of them had said they had alternate tools and they thought it would end the situation, if they had figured out how to obtain towing services, and if they had convinced you that the laws in Canada were sufficient to deal with the protests. Is that a correct understanding?
It would have had to have been more than one of them, but yes, this was a national emergency we were facing. But if there was compelling reasons why the Emergencies Act wasn't necessary, it certainly would have given me pause.
Thank you. You would agree that this is the very reason why proper and adequate consultation is so important and in fact required under the Emergencies Act?
Yes, that makes sense.
Okay. Don't you agree then that giving the First Ministers advance notice and time to prepare would have allowed the First Ministers to share with you the details and the input that you indicated to the Commission would be important to your decision making?
Throughout the 2 weeks, 3 weekends leading up to those conversations, we had many engagements with the provinces, the officials, ministers, and indeed there was a letter from the province of Alberta asking for exactly that, help with tow truck resources. And they felt very strongly that the federal government needed to step up with extra tools and extra support so that they could get those vehicles towed from Coutts. So there was engagement with the provinces throughout, and we were certainly all talking about what would be needed to put an end to these occupations and blockades.
And certainly there's been a lot of evidence before this commission about how Alberta solved the tow truck problem, so I won't get into that. But you would agree that none of the engagement you had with the provinces discussed at all the use of the Emergencies Act and whether it was necessary in the provinces?
The consultation on the use of the Emergencies Act needed to center around what we'd actually do with the Act. If I had consulted with the premiers early on without saying, these are the 6 things we would do with the Emergencies Act, their first question would be, okay, you might want to do this Emergencies Act, but what are you going to do with it? What powers will you be giving yourself or the federal government or our officials and police services? So there was ongoing conversations about tools, and the consultation on the Emergencies Act was done when we had a very clear list of the things we would actually be bringing in with the Emergencies Act.
I will put to you that the way the First Minister's meeting was arranged, which was a short notice invitation with no indication of the topic of discussion, meant that the discussions you did have with the First Ministers could not possibly provide you with the details that you needed to consider.
I disagree.
In your evidence today, you said that at the First Minister's meeting, you heard Premier Kenney say there was a plan for Coutts, but that you had heard that before and you were not convinced that morning that it would be put to use. Is that correct?
No, I had no reason to doubt Premier Kenney's goodwill and hopes that Coutts would be resolved soon. But I also knew that Coutts had been in place for, at that point, 3 weeks. There had been an ebb and a flow. There were moments where traffic was let through, moments where people showed up more intensely. And it goes to the preoccupation we had that even if, as he indicated, there were good chances that it would be cleared in the coming moments, there was going to be a continued challenge to hold open that area given the current context.
Minister Mendicino said at the IRG the afternoon previous, which you were present at, that there was going to be enforcement action at Coutts, correct?
Yes, it was something that we had been monitoring for a while. It would turn out that the RCMP, who had intended to do enforcement action as the provincial police force, many days, if not a week before, had to suspend it because of genuine concerns around officer safety and the presence of significant numbers of weapons and problematic individuals in that. So it was something we were anticipating and hoping was going to happen, certainly hoping was going to happen peacefully, but it was something that we had been hoping would happen for a while.
Yes, certainly, because what we saw was that the actions at Coots changed from public order policing activity into a criminal investigation. And around 8 p.m. on the night of the 13th, Commissioner Lucky emailed Minister Mendicino and Jody Thomas and advised them that the RCMP had an enforcement plan ready for execution and that they were indeed on the cusp of enforcement in Coots. And that proved to be true, correct?
Yes, it did. That was good news that it was true, yes.
So then why were you doubtful when Premier Kenney told you that he believed the situation had been secured and the RCMP would now proceed with broader arrests and secure the porter, when exactly what you had been told the night before about RCMP enforcement did in fact happen?
We had been told throughout the process, throughout these weeks, that things were about to happen. Sometimes they happened, sometimes they didn't, and not just at Coots, but elsewhere. So there was an understanding that inevitably things were more difficult than reality is always more difficult than plans. It was good news that the province was able to clear, but I will also say, or that the situation was able to be cleared in the province at that point. I will also say that it was done in part with resources drawn from British Columbia. And one of the things that Premier Horgan attested to or said in that meeting was he understands it's a national emergency. He understands and agreed with our use of things, but he was very concerned that even as he was worried about what was happening at the Surrey border crossings, as he was worried about convoy activity in the interior, in other parts of BC, he had to give up a number of police officers to help with enforcement in Alberta. And while, yes, it was good news that Alberta looked like it was going to be resolved, there was a constant challenge that the whack-a-mole challenge that was brought up in other contexts, that things kept coming back. And we had a level of concern that even if one place was resolved, the threat environment, the concerns we had were going to replicate themselves elsewhere.
And you understood that the police, the extra RCMP officers that were brought into Alberta were, of course, brought in under the Provincial Police Service Agreement,
yes,
not under any powers created under the Emergencies Act.
No, because they were brought in well before the Emergencies Act. But it did go to the challenge facing being a national emergency when we see police. Well, when we saw the police action in Ottawa at the end of that week, it drew on police members from forces spread across Ontario and beyond.
The Emergencies Act didn't change that, though.
It facilitated that.
It facilitated that. It didn't create police officers.
No,
correct?
But it highlighted that you couldn't just look at one place and say, oh, we have enough resources to fix in this one place. It was a broad challenge across the country at the same time. So Alberta being on a hopeful track at that moment was obviously good news, but it wasn't sufficient to say, oh, great, there's no more national emergency.
All right, I'm going to put to you the fact that you did have evidence that the laws in the provinces were sufficient to handle the blockades. And I'll give you two examples. One is that the Windsor Police, along with the OPP, cleared the blockade and the Ambassador Bridge was reopened before you made your decision, correct? Yes,
with the caveat that a lot of the people who were leaving the Ambassador Bridge were purportedly headed towards the Sarnia crossing or the Fort Erie crossing, meaning that there were still real concerns that even as we settled things in one place, the rhetoric across the country and the online activity indicated that people were not going home, but they were looking for the next thing they could engage with. Right. So
police powers were able to deal with the problem, correct? They were able to clear the blockade.
They were able
Yes.
to clear lanes at that moment, yes, in that spot.
Okay.
But there was
And
a
of
real
course-
concern there would be more.
Right.
Or they
The other
would return.
example is Coots, where the RCMP were able to safely conduct a criminal investigation, execute search warrants, and make arrests, correct?
Yes.
And that protesters in Coots indicated to RCMP that they wanted to leave the protest because they didn't want to be associated with the criminal elements uncovered, correct?
I can't speak to what their intent was.
Okay, we've heard evidence in this commission, so the commission knows what one of the protesters did indicate the intent was. Now, these are in fact the type of decreases in troublesome protest activity that you had been hoping to see in the weeks prior, weren't they?
Yes.
And definitely examples of how existing legal tools and police powers were effective at dealing with illegal portions of protests, correct?
Yes.
All right.
You're pretty well out of your time, so if you could.
And that's okay. I think I will end there. Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for answering my questions today.